Games Workshop Space Marine points update has been revealed to the internet. Looks like we've got cheaper Inceptors and Redemptors, incredibly cheap jump pack Intercessors and Scouts, and just a few choice nerfs. Let's talk through all the new points costs blow by blow. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marine points, and we can finally start establishing what's good or not in the new Space Marine Codex, as up to now we've been in a bit of a holding situation, where Games Workshop had unveiled the new rules for the Space Marine Codex, but it seemed that we were in limbo with points. When the rules for Codex Space Marines were unveiled, it did seem that we had all the new rules for the miniatures, though the points section in the book was clearly outdated. It had things like Primaris Desolation squads on 120 points, which again would have casually flipped them back into being perhaps one of the more overpowered units in 40k. And there were a whole bunch of other changes that looked like they'd been reverted to prior to the balance updates in early 10th edition. I think most people were strongly suspecting a new points update to Codex Space Marines to come along at some point, a digital download as an update to the Minotaur and Field manual, though weirdly Games Workshop has decided to let the cat out of the bag early and sent out a whole load of preview copies of the Minotaur and Field manual version 1.4. These have already been relayed by a good number of content creators all over the internet. I've seen the same thing from about 6 different sources already. It looks like these will be the points costs for the new Space Marine Codex, and I'd guess that the Minotaur and Field manual will probably be able to download around about 1 PM UK time if they go by their previous trends, so roughly 8 hours or so from when I'm recording this video. In any case, it's very cool to get a look as to what's changing and by how much for the Space Marines, and broadly it's good news for the Astartes. It seems that for the vast majority of the codex, either things stayed the same or went down in cost. Seems that around about half the codex dropped in cost, and almost all the rest stayed the same. And the nerfs that they had were kind of small. Only 2 units went up in cost, the Aggressors and Vulcan Hestan, and 1 enhancement. It seems kind of likely that a bunch of units dropping in cost might well have been to counteract the loss of old style Oath of Moment with the big wound rerolls. And it does appear that for a fair few cases Games Workshop has chosen to give buffs to the slightly more struggling units in Space Marines, though also weirdly enough quite a lot of strong stuff also managed to go down as well. In any case, let's talk through the sections one by one, starting out with the 2 major new units, and then we'll talk about the enhancement, then squads, vehicles and characters. First up, the price tags for the new units, the Assault Intercessors with jump packs and the Company Heroes. It seems that the Assault Intercessors with jump packs are cheaper than they were in the Codex, the Company Heroes are the same. Kind of a weird way around to have that, to be honest. At least from early assessment, I was guessing that the Assault Intercessors with jump packs would be quite nice at 90 points, fairly cheap for what they do and can bully enemy infantry. To have them go down to 85 points makes them very, very tempting indeed. It's just kind of weird to have a Space Marine unit that's this fast and as tough as most of their other cheap troops, and the damage output isn't even all that bad either. They get a bunch of mortal wounds and chainsword attacks, and then a few strikes from a power fist. They're looking very, very strong. Seems like Games Workshop wants to sell a bunch of their models, or at least encourage a lot of people to glue jump packs on their Assault Intercessors. Probably less good news for the Company Heroes though at 95 points. These guys are unchanged, and just for a bit of a random mixed role units, they just don't seem to be an amazing value proposition when paired with the captain that they need to buy in. They are fairly tanky, and it seems like their role would usually be to escort a character that doesn't actually want to buff with his own squad, which is kind of rare. It means that perhaps the best choice for them is Vulcan Hestan, or maybe Marnius Calgar potentially with his command point generation. Could be okay for them, but I feel like they're not going to be a common pick for competitive lists. Before we get into units, Fire Discipline was the single enhancement that was nerfed. This one's the new name for Bolter Discipline in the Gladius detachment, and easily the best enhancement out of any of them, giving you sustained hits for your unit, going to a 5+ for critical hits if you're in Devastator Doctrine, and that just stacks to massive extra value if you had either an Apothecary Biologist or a Lieutenant bearing the traits, as they could make all those 5+ critical hits into lethal hits as well. Perhaps not too surprising that it went up a little bit, given that it's kind of auto-include for most Gladius lists, but still it's only gone up from 25 points to 30 points. I still think it's easily worth it, given the crazy amount of destruction that you can do with Aggressors, or maybe something else like Hellblasters. I strongly suspect that this one's still going to see play. Moving on to squads and infantry, and one of the other units that got nerfed were the Aggressors, 110 points per squad of 3, so plus 10 points on what they were before. Perhaps a little bit of a shame for them, given that they were being keyed up to be an absolutely amazing unit in the new Codex Space Marines, not caring about the Oath of Moment change. Excellent in the Firestorm Force, and pretty amazing in Gladius with the Fire Discipline Warlord trait. This might be partly to compensate for them getting a 3+ to hit in close combat, which was quite a nice buff. Overall, I'd say they're probably a little bit weaker overall from the change from this, despite the 3+ to hit in melee, but I'd still rate them as a strong unit. Otherwise for the squads, for some reason Inceptors went down to 110 points, down from 115. Not really too sure what the thinking was for them. They're really quite common competitive staples with their big drop anywhere outside of 3 inches type rule. It means they can jump down, do secondary objectives, and maybe obliterate enemy objective holders that thought they were safe. Outriders dropped to 95 points per 3, so a -10 drop there, really quite a good buff. Even after they went down to 105 points, I still would have considered them very underwhelming, seeing as they just don't really do anything besides against infantry. I feel at 95 points they're a lot more palatable though. They are fairly sturdy for the cost and move fast. With a bunch of strength 4 and damage 1 attacks, they're never going to be mainline damage dealers, but could have a bit of value as a utility unit. I still think that most people might be more tempted by things like those new jump intercessors though. Next up, it looks like both flavours of Terminator went down a little bit. The regular Terminators are now just 185 points per 5, and the Assault Squad is 195. The standard Terminator drop might partly be to compensate it for losing the Ignores modifiers type thing. Maybe a little bit of a side grade overall, but never too bad to see a points cut on one of the biggest hitting damage dealers in the Codex. They're one of the best units for putting stratagems and characters into. The Assault Squad narrows the gap a little bit with the regular Terminator squad and will compete a bit better as a result. One of the other really big winners with a Scout Squad. Again, they have a perhaps surprisingly good points decrease, going down from 65 points to 55, and this is despite gaining the nice buff of getting an extra sniper rifle in the unit. At that cost, they're a seriously cheap little unit that can start in the mid-board, enough melee threats to bully lighter infantry of other factions, one heavy weapon and a sniper rifle for a little bit more ranged threat, and not too bad with their 2 wound toughness each these days. I feel like these are going to be very tempting to start in the mid-board now, and might actually rival the Eliminators as a forward deploy utility type unit. Previously I would have gone Eliminators all the way, with Scouts a bit more expensive than this. Finally, for the infantry squads, the Stern Guard are down to 100 points, down by 10. Again, I consider this one a bit more of a side grade than a direct upgrade though. They were perhaps the worst hit unit by losing the old style Oath of Moments to fish for devastating wounds with all that shooting. Plus they also had their special rule nerfed as well. Just reroll once to wound against the Oath target I think will usually be less valuable than a big burst of double shoot once per game. Onto vehicles next, and for Walkers and Dreadnoughts, the Ballistus Dreadnought continues its slow march towards a lower points value. It started on 170, now it's all the way down to 140 after a couple of points cuts. I feel like this guy's actually looking pretty nice now, and is actually starting to compete with the Gladiator Lancer, which was just far better than it for the original points cost it had. Kind of nice for all the people out there who picked up the Leviathan box. The Invicta Tactical Warsuit is 140 points, so that one's -10 compared with what it was before. Seems kind of fun for the Ironstorm Spearhead, that one, with the big walker buffing stratagem. This one got a very small ability nerf in Codex Space Marines, but not all that much. Perhaps surprisingly going down is the Redemptor Dreadnought, down to 200 points now from 210. This one was already very effective, and at least a reasonably common including competitive lists. A fairly substantial points cut on that is going to make it even better, with its big -1 damage and dangerous general purpose threats. To be honest, I was kind of surprised to see the Brutalis Dreadnought not going down. This was 175 points before, and it still is now. If anything, I would have rated this as perhaps the single one that needed the most help still, even despite its good melee combat. The regular Dreadnought is also unchanged from the digital points. Next up, we've got some tanks, speeders, and flyers. It seems that the hover fortresses of the Primaris have gone down, the repulsors down to 190, and the repulsor executioner to 220. Again, I must admit, maybe a bit of an unexpected points decrease, those ones. Both of them really quite efficient already, and they've got some very nice detachments that they could make good use of with the Firestorm and the Ironstorm spearheads. I guess perhaps it's partly just to compensate from losing Oath of Moment, but seeing a points cut to an already good unit is pretty big. The Whirlwind's 145 points, so -5 from the 150. I still say maybe not a standout, I think that's quite balanced really. It does put out some okay Ignore's line of sight firepower, but you do pay a premium for it. All three flavours of the Storm Speeder dropped 10 points. Unfortunately, the Hailstrike took a rather big nerf in the Codex though. Its extra AP debuff now no longer works on monsters and vehicles, so it's even more locked to killing infantry than it was before. Maybe the Thunderstrike could still be nice to debuff big enemy vehicles if they get particularly big in the meta. I'd probably rate them as kind of usable though not standout. Finally, the various Stormflyers went down a bit. The Stormhawks now 155 but must start off the board. The Storm Talons 165 and the Storm Ravens 240. I'd perhaps be most tempted by the Storm Raven out of any of those. Could be interesting in the Firestorm force, I suppose. A transport to use their shenanigans with, plus the potential for a massive flurry of Strength 5 Hurricane Bolters. Otherwise, plenty of tanks and things were untouched. I was a bit sad to see no help out for the Vindicator here. I feel like the Predator Destructor could have still gone down a little bit, but it seems they've been left where they were. Otherwise, for the subcategories of vehicle units, we've got artillery, fortification and transports. The Firestrike servo turrets were definitely a bit overcosted before, now they're dropping 5 points to 75 points each. I feel like that is kind of meaningful. I think I'd still be tempted most by the last Talon over the auto cannons. I feel like they're alright now. I'd still probably be more tempted by something that's got more mobility, as good firepower might not mean much if you can't get it to see the thing that you need to shoot. The Hammerfall Bunker takes a whopping points cut down to 175 points. Unfortunately though, Games Workshop kind of ruined its auto defenses type rule in the Codex. It's now just a free Overwatch per turn. And I think due to that change, if anything, it might be as bad as before, if not worse. The Razorback drops down from 100 points down to 95, though it did lose its twin-linked assault cannon option, which was kind of a nice one. Could be okay with a las cannon and transporting some devastators with multi-melters in that Firestorm assault force. Potentially having reroll wound rolls and maybe even +1 to wound with a stratagem could be pretty punchy. For the Primaris though, the Impulsor gets yet cheaper. It's now all the way down to just 80 points, genuinely now having a pretty good defensive stat line for the cost, as well as generally packing far more firepower than most transports do for the cost. You could have that Bellicastus missile for a single big shot, plus a stubber and a bunch of Storm Bolters, and also have some Space Marines inside firing out the top hatch. I feel like it's definitely getting to the point where a Squadron and an Impulsor really isn't a bad choice in a list whatsoever. Then finally we've got the character choices, and this was perhaps the area of the Codex where Games Workshop made the most points cuts. The vast majority of the Space Marine character choices went down by a little bit, a few of them by quite a lot. Weirdly, the captain seemed to be the most neglected out of this, all bar the captain with the jump pack. Kind of feels like he's being singled out as he's got a nice shiny new model for Games Workshop to encourage you to buy. To be fair, I think he was pretty niche and mediocre before. He drops down from 100 to 85. And that's looking a lot more credible for a jump intercessor type squad. Still though, you'd have to weigh up between him leading a unit or an entire extra unit of them at 85 points. Otherwise the other captains didn't change at all. The Gravis captain's still 80, who'll be quite nice leading aggressors in the Firestorm force maybe. Kind of surprising that the captains out of anyone didn't get points cuts given Games Workshop's recent adjustments to free stratagems. For the lieutenant, the standard Primaris one dropped down to 65 points. Again, he was a very efficient choice before, and now he's even better. Lethal hits helps out so many units that have got middle to low strength. The Phobos one and the Reaver one both dropped to 55, maybe slightly more niche uses there. And for the Librarians, the standard one drops down to 65, bringing his 4+ invulnerable saves. The Phobos one to 65, kind of interesting for his lone operative type buff there. And the Terminator one's all the way down to 75 points. I feel like he's going to compete a lot more strongly against the Terminator Captain now. He gives you sustained hits on all your attacks, so it's basically a flat damage boost to the units for fairly cheap. The Chaplains basically all went down in cost as well. The standard Primaris one is 60 -5, the Biker Captain's 75, again -5, and the Jump Pack one's 75 as well, -5 once more. I guess if you wanted to use biker characters in the Stormlance detachment, then both him and the Outriders going down is good news. Again, the Terminator Chaplain takes an unusually large cut. He also so happens to be the new miniature that Games Workshop put on pre-order just recently. He gives the Terminators a +1 to wound in combat, though to be fair to him, I feel like he maybe deserved a bit more of a cut than most, given that Games Workshop kind of ruined his mortal wound defense ability by making devastating wounds not mortal wounds anymore. Otherwise, the Ancient went down 5 points to 50, the Terminator one to 75, and the Blade Guard one to 45. I feel like particularly the Terminator and Blade Guard ones are kind of fine in concert with another character. maybe luxury picks for an extra tooled up unit. Still not really convinced by the standard one that much though. Perhaps one of the single biggest winners out of this entire points update is the standard Tech Marine. He goes down from 65 to 55, so a points cut of 10 there. And that's perhaps a surprisingly good change as well. This guy was already good before. Perhaps one of the HQs of choice in competitive Space Marine lists. Dropping him down by more than most characters just makes him absolutely stand out. Pretty much auto-include in your army I think now if you've got a couple of big vehicles for him to buff. Repairs and +1 to hit are both nice, plus he's got an okay profile, and he actually is fairly savage in melee if the opponent makes the mistake of killing one of his creations. It's pretty amazing news for people wanting to run the Ironstorm Spearhead as well, as Tech Marines are kind of mandatory in that. Running 3 of them now seems like a pretty reasonable idea, tooled up with some of the enhancements. Finally, the Apothecary is 50 points, so down 5. He's maybe a little bit more of a niche choice. Not terrible though, you just need a big scary unit that you think is likely to be damaged but not outright destroyed in one turn. The Biologist remains the same points and is still very good for aggressors and friends, and the Judas here drops down to 70 points from 75 if you want a little bit of fights first for your Blade Guard. Overall, basically, the vast majority of the Space Marine HQ section got a bit cheaper. I feel like lists are probably going to become just a little bit more character heavy as a result, as there's a lot of value here. Finally, for the Space Marine points adjustments, we've got the Epic Heroes from the core Codex. Again, most of these went down, but again, Games Workshop have selected a few that didn't, targeting the ones that saw a fair bit of competitive play already. For the Ultramarines, I think it might be a bit of a disappointment for Rabute Gilliman. He only dropped down 20 points to 360, and I feel like between the nerf to Oath of Moment and also locking his free stratagems to battle tactics, that's not really enough to compensate for that. I'd say it's playable, but probably not standout for that price tag. I must admit I do really quite like Chief Librarian Tigurius though. I feel like he was kind of underrated at 80 points before. Multiple durability buffs, a pretty savage psychic shooting attack, some okay melee, and some free stratagems. There's just a ridiculous amount of things to like, hanging out in a Sternguard squad or something. Otherwise, small points decreases to Lysander, Corsaro Khan, Kavan Shrike, Pedro Cantor, and Adrax Agatone. They all go down 5 points. For some reason, Tor Garadon gets skipped over here, even though they took away his lethal hits on his previous datasheet. I feel like all of these bring something pretty interesting for their cost. Kavan Shrike's lone operative shenanigans could be particularly interesting with the new assault intercessors with jump packs, and Adrax of the Salamanders is looking very nice leading some Blade Guards. His combat stats are great, and allowing them to reroll all wound rerolls just for 85 points alone is pretty massive. Finally though, it's not all good news for the Salamanders. Vulcan Hestan goes up to 100 points, so plus 20 there. Kind of a bit unfortunate for Salamander's players, though honestly I think he's still fine at that points cost. Seems Games Workshop realised just how much power he could bring with rerolling wound rolls for either Melter or Torrent. In particular in that Firestorm force with the 2 CP stratagem for devastating wound torrents, you can have things like Infernus Marines belting out something like 10 or 11 devastating wounds per shooting phase if they're buffed by Vulcan. Definitely lessens his value a little bit, but I still think he is a good model due to the power of his buff. Overall, I feel like it's perhaps surprisingly good news for the Space Marines. I guess after seeing how the faction was performing with the old-style Oath of Moment, they perhaps decided that they needed a boost to compensate for that being toned down, and maybe these sweeping small points cuts are perhaps the culmination of that. Out of the big list that we've just been through, I feel like these are some of my favourites. 85-point jump intercessors seem amazing to have as a utility skirmish unit. I'll certainly look forward to trying out a few of those for my Blood Angels. 55-point scouts are excellent screening units to hold the midfield, still capable of being a fairly okay damage and defensive threat, particularly for that points cost as well. The 220-point Repulsor Executioner was a good unit that got better, as was the Redemptor at 200. Inceptors going down was kind of surprising, seeing as they're pretty great already, and lots of lists were running them for the pop-up 3-inch deep strike nastiness. Tech Marines are pretty amazing at 55 points, almost auto-include if you've got a couple of big fighty vehicles now, and I feel like I wouldn't underestimate an 80-point Impulsor. That's a very cheap looking transport now for what it does. Pretty good news for carting around some Hellblasters, Eliminators, or perhaps being a battle bunker for some assault units to charge out of, maybe some Black Templar Sword Brethren. Let me know what you make of the points changes though. Have any units of your collection suddenly got an unexpected lease of life here? I look forward to your thoughts on how these fit in with the new Space Marine detachments down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to keep up with Games Workshop's news and releases, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly try and report on any of their game update news here on the channel. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaway with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.